In the very center of Nigeria lies a region that has quietly become the country's most dangerous fault line. It is not just a battlefield of communities, it is also the battlefield of faiths. It is also a contest over identity, land, power, and the future of Nigeria's state itself. This is the Middle Belt. And what happens here may determine what Nigeria becomes. If the Middle Belt decides to follow the South becomes the biggest part of Nigeria. If the Middle Belt continues to be part of the North, then the North remains the biggest part of Nigeria and demonstrably the biggest population, the biggest landmass, and may continue to dominate Nigeria's politics as it has always been. What if the Middle Belt fragments? What will happen to Nigeria? My name is Romande Shawulu. This is Update. The Middle Belt is not a formal region on Nigeria's administrative map. It is something more complex, a political, cultural, and a geographical construct. It stretches across central Nigeria, from the east in Adamawa, Taraba, through Benue, Plateau, Nasarawa, Niger, Kogi, and the Federal Capital Territory, as well as parts of Kaduna, parts of Kebbi State, parts of Borno, Gombe, and of course parts of Yobe State. But more than geography, it represents a transition zone between the North and the South, between different identities, between competing visions of Nigeria. This region is home to hundreds of ethnic groups, many of them mutually not the same. Many of them have fought wars with themselves. It was also a scene or an area where there have been multiple types of ethnic conflicts between various communities and the Sokoto Caliphate before colonial rule in Nigeria. This region is home to hundreds of ethnic groups. It is religiously mixed with a predominant Christian population, a shrinking population of traditional believers, and a significant Muslim community. They coexist, sometimes uneasily and uncomfortably. It is also Nigeria's agricultural heartland, produces most of the food that is consumed in Nigeria, and perhaps has the greater mass of Nigeria's agricultural belt. But perhaps more important, it is Nigeria's buffer zone, and increasingly its battleground. It is what separates the South from the North. It possesses characteristics of the South and characteristics of the North. And in terms of the climate and the weather, some of the rainforests of the South exist in the Middle Belt, into the Middle Belt too. What is the historical context? The conflict in the Middle Belt did not begin today. It is layered, shaped by centuries of interaction, domination, resistance, and adaptation. Of course, the people of the Middle Belt have been subjects of massive enslavement and slave trade during the Trans-Saharan slave trade. And also, in the transatlantic slave trade, there were many communities, several people from the Middle Belt that were also captured and shipped to the Americas. Many Middle Belt communities resisted expansion from the Sokoto Caliphate. They were not just territorial conflicts, they were struggles over identity, autonomy, and belief system. And there was a stalemate in some parts before the colonial authorities took over all of Nigeria and did handed over many parts of the Middle Belt to the Caliphate. British colonial administration introduced the indirect rule system, governing through Northern Emirates. This was a system the colonial authorities learned from their experience in India, where they did not want to spend money or did not have the money to spend on direct ruling or direct rule administration over many of the communities that they had. So they decided to just use the existing administrative structure. And the former administrative structure that existed before then was the Emirates system, the Sokoto Caliphate. This, of course, created a structural imbalance. Many ethnic groups in the Middle Belt were placed under authorities they did not historically belong to. Resentment took place. Protests also took place. Of course, the colonial authorities were unrelenting. Even when communities of the Middle Belt joined in struggling and fighting for the creation of a Middle Belt region, that will separate them from the caliphate. After 1960, tensions evolved into political struggles. Questions of who belongs, indigene versus settler, became central. Access to land, political representation, and economic opportunity became tied to identity. As a matter of fact, when the Sardauna, the premier of northern Nigeria, was in authority, he saw it as his task and responsibility to continue with the good work of his ancestors, and he sought to expand the rule of the caliphate over many more communities that did not belong. And so access to government patronage a lot of times then depended on whether any person Islamized or did not Islamize. Since the return to democracy, violence has intensified. The so-called farmer herders conflicts have escalated. Ethno-religious clashes have deepened. Local disputes have become militarized. What we are witnessing today is not just spontaneous violence. It is the accumulation of unresolved historical conflicts and tensions, minority ethnic groups fighting themselves, and of course, the general fight between the groups from the caliphate that these indigenous groups have seen as not being part of them. And so today, the Middle Belt is not defined by just one conflict. It is defined by overlapping layers of violence, some of them intersecting, some on parallel lines, making it difficult for analysts and researchers to understand, because these crises differ from community to community. They differ from state to state, and one narrative may not be able to explain all the conflicts and the sources of the conflicts that we have today raging in the Middle Belt. At the surface, there is the farmer-herders conflict, which appears to be dispute over land. Farmers expand cultivation. Herders move cattle across traditional routes. But beneath this lies something much deeper. Competition over shrinking resources, breakdown of traditional agreements, increasing use of firearms. What was once seasonal friction between farmers and herders has become a deadly confrontation that appears to be defying reactive actions that the government has taken. Secondly, we have the ethno-religious violence. Identity has become weaponized. Communities are mobilized not just as neighbors, but as ethnic or religious blocs. Retaliation fuels retaliation. Violence becomes cyclical, and so the beat continues. There is also the militia and armed groups that are increasing in number. In the absence of an effective state protection program, communities form their own defense structures. These groups begin as protection, but can often evolve into offensive actors, and sometimes they evolve into criminal gangs, terrorizing even the communities that they were set up to protect. This creates localized security dilemmas. Because everyone is afraid and arms, there is widespread arms race across many communities. As a matter of fact, there is also the fact that in many of these communities, youths and community leaders are adapting where they do not have arms, they forge arms and construct locally produced arms, which security agencies have been talking about. Of course, there's also the spillover from the wider Nigerian security problem. Banditry from the northwest is moving inward towards the Middle Belt. Arms from the Sahel are flowing across the borders and reaching the Middle Belt. The Middle Belt is no longer isolated. It is connected to wider regional conflicts. And of course, large number of people that were displaced from the northeast, particularly ethnic nationalities from Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, have fled to the Middle Belt, forming their own communities, forming their associations, and becoming permanent IDPs in the places that they have moved to. This is therefore not one war. It is multiple overlapping wars, interacting, reinforcing, and escalating each other. What are the drivers of this conflict, and where have these conflicts persisted and intensified? People point to the land and demography. Population growth has increased pressure on land. Agriculture is expanding. Pastoral routes are shrinking. Conflicts becomes inevitable forms when managing land that is not expanding. And of course, we've had also the fact that in many of those communities in the Middle Belt, including Benue and Plateau, there is massive illegal mining going on in places like Niger, Benue, Plateau, and Taraba State. And this also brings to bear some of the pressures that we have. The popular belief in the development world is that there is climate pressure. Environmental change, according to this narrative, is pushing headers southward. This intensifies contact and conflict with farming communities. The third driver, as far as many analysts are concerned, is the existence of weak land governance in the country. There is no clear, enforceable system governing land use. Ownership is contested, access is disputed, and this creates permanent instability. Analysts also point to the collapse of traditional mechanisms. In the past, local leaders mediated conflicts. Today, these mechanisms are weakened or bypassed. And of course, traditional rulers speak of the past when headers, whenever they want to enter any new local jurisdiction, they will send emissaries and messages ahead, sought permission before they entered those lands. And they also stated in the permissions that they look for how long they will stay, the number of cattle that they were moving with, and when they will leave the land that they were going to. And so there was a record of the number of cattle that entered any jurisdiction and the number of headsmen and when they will leave the place. This system has collapsed, replaced by violence acquisition, and replaced by the fact that today the governance system is weak, and there appears to be what some analysts call the marginalization of the Nigerian state. And then there is the driver of politicization of identity. Ethnicity and religion are no longer just identities, they are political tools. Leaders mobilize communities along those lines, often deepening division. Yes, we've spoken of the proliferation of arms. Weapons are now more easily accessible, and some researchers say that there are over 500 million small arms and light weapons circulating in the West African region. And of this, 500 million small arms and light weapons, 170 million are circulating in Nigeria alone. And it is easy to see that the Middle Belt will be host to millions of such arms. Now, because of the availability of these weapons, conflicts that might once have been contained easily now escalate rapidly. And finally, there is the much talked state failure in security response. Of course, systems of local governance has collapsed in most parts of the Middle Belt. Traditional institutions do not have the respect that it used to have. Security forces are present, but often reactive, overstretched, or mistrusted, especially in the Middle Belt, where if you check in most of the local governments, the security agencies, even the police force is almost non-existent. And of course, the local governments do not have the resources or money since the state governments commandeered their allocations to hold security meetings and to be early responders or have effective early warning systems that can help the situation. There is also the danger that because the police and security are almost absent in most of the Middle Belt, there is impunity and raiders come into those communities in the night, kill, destroy, and leave, and you hardly hear over the years of any response of the state in terms of arrest or even prosecution of the people that have been raiding communities. So why does the Middle Belt matter? The Middle Belt is not just another conflict zone. It is central to Nigeria's future. Number one, the region sits between the north and south. If it fractures, it could deepen national divisions. If it fractures, hundreds and millions of people will flood out of Nigeria. And of course, any destabilization of the Middle Belt is likely to destabilize both the south and the north of Nigeria. Secondly, the Middle Belt produces a significant portion of Nigerians' food. If famine collapses, the consequences will be nationwide. Thirdly, violence does not remain contained. If violence breaks out in the Middle Belt, is likely to spread into cities, into other regions, and into the national consciousness. There is also the fact that the Middle Belt is electorally significant. Its stability affects national elections and political balance. Where the Middle Belt decides to vote in a contested election between the North and the South, that position of the Middle Belt is likely going to be the one that will carry the victory. As pointed out before, if the Middle Belt decides to be part of the South, the South becomes the bigger part of Nigeria. If it chooses to remain with the North still remains the bigger part of Nigeria. If the Middle Belt is destabilized, the challenges of state legitimacy of Nigeria will expand. When citizens are not protected, trust in the state erodes, and without trust, governance weakens. Of course, the government has done its best in trying to respond to the crisis in the Middle Belt. Government responses have been very extensive but uneven. There has been deployment of military to many hotspots in the Middle Belt, but this is hampered by the need for the military in the Niger Delta, in the Northwest, and in the Northeast. And now, what has been government response to all these crises and conflicts in the Middle Belt? Government has always had different types of interventions, but these interventions are usually uneven and do not appear to have the trust of people. There is first the deployment of troops to hotspots, but deployments are often reactive, arriving after violence has occurred. And of course, the fact that the military is overstretched, doing operations in almost all the states of the country, as well as in the Southeast, special operations in the Northeast, special operations in the South, Northwest, special operations. These constraints mean that the Middle Belt has not had the required complements of security forces to bring down the marauding gunmen that have harassed and sent millions of people from their ancestral homes. Secondly, there have been the interventions by the state governments. The state governments have attempted to regulate the grazing of cattle. Laws were made in Benue and Taraba States. Taraba State did not even implement the law. The Benue State implementing and halted the law. And we've had crisis now where the debate as to the desirability or otherwise of having the anti-open grazing laws in place has been raging. But of course, most commentators forget the fact that the open grazing is just a new phenomenon in Nigeria, that in the past, herders needed permission of their host communities before going to herd their cattle. And indeed, as was pointed out to President Muhammadu Buhari when he visited Taraba State, the regulations of the northern regions government required that herdsmen go into new territories or different domains after the required permission has been granted by the receiving domain. And in that case, they were always required to submit details of their movements and also state when they will leave such land. But of course, the fact that today anybody moves his cattle anywhere without regulations, without even permission of the local authorities, means that you have even non-state actors, violent non-actors, masquerading and pretending to be herdsmen and extending and deepening the distrust between herdsmen and farmers. There have also been peace initiatives, but these peace initiatives are always short-lived, and these peace initiatives have not had much effect. Kaduna State, Southern Kaduna in particular, has had several peace talks. But even while the peace talks are going on, killings and destructions follow. And of course, policy tensions, the fact that federal government has different narrative from what the narrative that state governments have has resulted in a lot of fragmentation. And this has meant that the responses of the state governments are usually different from the responses of the federal government. The understanding of the crisis by the communities are usually very different from the understanding that the federal government and even the state governments operate. Of course, this has been one of the major reasons why these efforts by governments have failed, because governments, both at the state level and at the national level, appear to be addressing symptoms and not really the problems. How does the future look like? The first scenario that people often point to, and it has a probability of over 45%, is the fact that violence will intensify. Communities will become more militarized. Cultural production will decline. There are indicators of this. Yes, there are indications. There's increased frequency of attacks. There's expansion of these attacks into areas which had not seen these attacks before. And increasingly, the bravado, the boldness with which this violence is taking place mean that the violence is not about to abate. The second scenario is the probability, that is 35%, that the government will be able to manage the crisis. Well, if it does, violence will continue, but it will be more contained. Nigeria will adapt but will not resolve these conflicts? And how about the possibility of stabilization? Analysts give this only 20%. And the 20% will depend on structural reforms in terms of the land governance and security coordination and proper narrative and understanding of the crisis by the security agencies. And of course, this will also mean that economic pressures that produce violent youths and ready army will happen in the next few years. And over time, violence will reduce. What are the strategic implications of the continuing violence in the Middle Belt? First, if the Middle Belt collapses into prolonged crisis, Nigeria's stability will be threatened. Food systems will be disrupted. Migration pressures will increase. Several millions of Southerners who migrated from the north because of the pressures of the religious riots of the 80s and 90s, as well as the recent violence by bandits, terrorists, and Boko Haram, will require moving. Will demand that these people who have moved here may need to again relocate from here to the south. Of course, there's also the challenge of regional instability in West Africa deepening, because many of the people that will migrate from the Middle Belt may not remain in Nigeria. They may seek for solace outside Nigeria. And this crisis, therefore, is not a local one. It is a national crisis and it's a regional risk. The Middle Belt, of course, is not just a region. It is a mirror reflecting Nigeria's deepest challenges: identity, governance, source competition, state capacity, the challenge of the Nigerian state being marginalized and unable to perform functions that it should perform, the citizens taking up space, and even non-state actors, violent state actors, taking up the space that the state should be governing. And this is also a warning, because what is happening in the Middle Belt today could define Nigeria tomorrow. If the Middle Belt stabilizes, Nigeria stabilizes. If it fractures further, the consequences will not remain in the Middle Belt. They will shape the future of the entire nation. My name is Rumande Shawulu. This is your update from the other side. I'd like you to take a few minutes to head over to Amazon to check a copy of the book, Middle Belt. I'll leave the link in the description for you to check. You'll be able to understand what we mean by the Middle Belt and the history and the comments of both people from the north and the south about the Middle Belt. As well, you see the number of tribes or ethnic groups that are in the Middle Belt, because it does appear as if the Tower of Babel may have fallen in the Middle Belt, where you have literally more than 500 distinct ethnic groups. We also like you to join our channel by clicking on that subscribe button and also the notification button, so that you'll be informed ahead of time anytime we do a new posting.